morning. Thanks for those attending the conference early today after the great dinner we had yesterday, last night. First of all, congratulations. Happy birthday to Barbara Rosenberg. It's a great honor to have here with us as keynote of this conference, Professor Giannella. Professor Giannella is the chair of the Global Forum of Competition at OECD, and it's unnecessary to describe his bio and contributions to competition law and enforcement all over the world. Many years of dedication to the antitrust field, and it's a great pleasure for IBRAC to have Professor Giannella here and speaking to us about what's going on in the antitrust world nowadays. Not easy task, and I will invite my colleague Renata to ask the first question. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to describe myself. I do it in Portuguese. Sou homem branco, de barba, careca, de meia idade. Thanks, Renata, for reminding me of who I am.
Bom dia a todos. Eu vou fazer minha autodescrição em português e depois eu passo para inglês. Eu sou uma mulher branca, morena, de cabelos compridos, eu diria de meia idade, com espírito bem jovem, assim como Ribas. So, good morning, and Professor Giannella, such a great pleasure to have you here. We are asking all the panelists to do a brief description of themselves, just for those who are attending and cannot see, as we have also for those who cannot listen as well. So I want to start making a question from your great experience. Which are the main topics in competition law enforcement that you see currently being addressed or discussing at the OECD level?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I mean, I've known about the IBRAC conference for many years, and this is the first opportunity I have to be with you, and I'm very thankful for your invitation. Let me start by looking at the acronym of OECD, because I think there are a few letters that are meaningful. One of them is the C, which means cooperation. So one of the topics, of course, in an institution like OECD is exchanging experiences between competition authorities and trying to agree on good practices. The D is for development. So there is a dimension which is looking forward about what are the challenges and the new issues which are going to come. And the final letter that I would mention is the E, which stands for economic, but it's economic policy in general. So it calls for the interaction or the interrelation between competition and other economic disciplines. And I think that this is a fairly accurate description of what the Competition Committee has been doing all those years. And if we talk about the near future, I think there are three dimensions or three kinds of topics that we are dealing with. The first one is we have spent a lot of time looking at the digital sector, and we continue doing it because there are many different issues or many new issues that are coming up in the digital sector, which are different from what you find in competition in the traditional sector. So I'm not going to go through the 20 or so panels that we have already organized, but just to give you a sense of what we do, next week there is the Latin American and Caribbean Competition Forum of OECD in Asunción, and we're going to look at remedies in digital markets, for example. In December at the Global Forum of OECD, we're going to look at AI and how it changes competition on downstream markets. In the Competition Committee in December as well, we're going to look at competition and AI infrastructure and the issues of barriers to entry or And there is another proposal that in June we might look at the digital sector and competition and consumer issues in the digital sector. So just to say that there is one nexus, which is a large number of questions about the digital. The second large nexus is the relationship between competition and other topics or wider topics. And from that point of view, again, if I take the LSACF next week as an example, we're going to look at competition and productivity, which has been an issue in many countries. In December, we're going to look at prudential regulation in the financial markets and competition, which is a hugely important issue in Europe because the functioning of the capital markets determines whether or not innovation really is financed these days. And there is a proposal that in June we're going to look at national security as a defense in merger cases. So this is, again, looking at the link between competition and other policies. And finally, there are more traditional topics which relate to the C of cooperation. For example, in June, we're going to look at prioritization and prosecutorial discretion by competition authorities. So this is more of an exchange of practices between competition authorities. We're going to look at cooperation in the designs of antitrust remedies. So I think those three groups are pretty much the groups of topics that we have on our plate.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor, talking about topics, what's on in the agenda nowadays, what are your views on the new trends of competition law? So we are seeing growth in the UK, labor markets in the past administration in the US, sustainability all over the world, and also in Brazil. It's a hot topic in the agenda nowadays. What are your views on these new trends? What should we expect from competition enforcement in the next years?
This is a very wide and important topic, to be honest. I think that it's good to go back at the beginning of the century, 25 years ago, and to think about a number of events which have taken place and which have changed I would say, the framework in which competition policy and competition law enforcement operate. The first element, which is well known, is kind of a disappointment with globalization, discontent, if I use Joseph Stiglitz's expression, which is essentially due to the fact that trade liberalization, which was designed to increase competition, really, through international competition, was sold on the idea that it was a win-win game, that everybody would win if there was more competition, better allocation of resources. And nobody ever said that in the competition game, there are losers as well as winners. And none of the governments, when they were pushing the trade liberalization agenda, really put into place policies that would help the mobility of, in particular, the labor factor. Okay, what happens when you get displaced because somebody abroad does what you do more cheaply, and all of a sudden, so take the steel industry in Europe and in the US as an example. Does anybody around help you acquire new skills, move to a place where there are more dynamic industries? And so people realized that there were costs. There was a huge cost, disruptive cost, which was in addition to the fact that there was somewhat of a feeling after the arrival of China in the WTO that there may be some kind of unfair competition going on as well, and that maybe we had accepted China into the WTO, which was a good thing, but too early or without requesting sufficient changes. So that was the first element that drove people a bit away from the idea of competition by saying, well, there's a cost to competition. But things got much worse after that. There was, in 2008, the financial crisis. Okay, so the financial crisis told us a couple of things. One of them, that apparently perfectly competitive markets, such as the real estate market in the US or the mortgage market in the US, can fail. The exuberance of markets. Okay, So competition may be not the solution for everything. There may be a need for regulation to complement competition, which was not a widely perceived necessity before that. And the second thing that it brought to the fore was the fact that if you live in a globalized world, you give up part of your strategic independence. And we've seen, for example, if you go to the UK, where the financial sector suffered quite massively from the events which were in fact happening in the US, an example of this. So again, the idea was that, well, maybe globalization has costs, or maybe globalization is not as satisfying as we had hoped it would be in the last quarter of the previous century. Then we go to 2020, there's the COVID crisis, and some of the same issues come to the fore. We don't have masks, we don't have respirators, we don't have vaccines. And there are several issues that come to the fore. One of them is that even competitive markets, like a lot of medical markets, take a long time to adjust when there is an exogenous shock to supply and demand and disequilibrium between the two. And there is an externality there, because while you don't have masks, the COVID spreads. Okay, so the fact that the market doesn't clear very rapidly actually has a cost, and that maybe government should intervene to try to speed up the process. Second, maybe we shouldn't be entirely dependent on very distant production centers, because what happens when those centers are locked down, we are the victims. So again, the idea of resilience comes to the fore. And then third, okay, we need to develop a vaccine real fast. Okay, competition is going to lead to innovation. Yes, but Operation Warp Speed in the US, which is cooperation between competitors, goes even faster than competition. So after all, competition may not be the answer to all the issues. Okay, then we have a few other things. One of them is that economists, and I'm talking about microeconomists, came up with two sets of very disturbing results. One of them had to do with the fact that in the US, and then the same results were found in Europe a little bit later, over the last 20 or 30 years, concentration has increased, profit margin have increased, and the turnover of firms has decreased, which everybody thought would mean that the competition is not as intense as it used to be, in spite of the fact that there have been competition authorities and what they claim has been a very active and well-founded competition policy. So maybe competition law and competition policy is not sufficient. And then there has been another set of results, this time at the macroeconomic level, certainly for Europe, but also for the US, that productivity and innovation, which presumably were supposed to be facilitated by competition, weren't there. And that we had pretty dismal results compared to the US in terms of increase in productivity or in terms of innovation. So something was wrong. Okay. And the US itself, which was doing a little bit better than we was not doing nearly as well as some of the Asian countries, which had huge increases in so that brought back the idea that, well, after all, maybe industrial policy has a role. Competition policy has been trying to shoo away industrial policy, but maybe that's not so right. The fourth dimension, and I'm going to start by the fifth, the fourth dimension is the repeated reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. By now, we've had 7 reports. And by now, a lot of countries and a lot of governments are convinced that there can be a negative externality associated with efficient production, which is the fact that the depletion of natural resources. And that maybe efficiency is not the only value that we should pursue. Maybe there's something else, sustainability, including in our utility function, the welfare of people, of future generations. Okay. The very last one in this list of catastrophes is the rapid rise of the digital sector. Okay. And competition authorities have been very confused about competition in the digital sector because, first of all, it's not price competition. So they're not used to something which is not price competition. Second, it's not pipeline firm that buy inputs and then transform it and then sell it to consumers. It's really platforms which are congregation of firms that put together baskets of services which are differentiated but somehow compete with each other. Okay, and on top of this, the platforms are not embedded in a particular market. I mean, they're embedded with a technology, but with this technology, they can go to different markets, as we saw, for example, when Meta bought Instagram, and Instagram became a social media. So nothing works. None of the instruments that we have, okay, we define the market, we look whether there's a dominant position and whether there is none of that actually works for the digital sector, with the result that competition authority are notoriously being unable to prevent concentration and possibly abuses in the sector because they did not have the right tools. Now, when you put all of this together, what it means is two things. First of all, there's a real questioning of the effectiveness of competition law enforcement more than competition policy as being an appropriate tool. There's a revival of the idea of industrial policy and government intervention, which doesn't mean that competition should be entirely discarded, but what it says is that maybe there's also a need for complementary things. And second, in terms of societal values, at least in Europe, but I think in a number of countries, efficiency is lost ground to competing concern, resilience, sustainability, strategic independence, innovation, and growth. And those are issues that competition authorities have to face.
I was listening to your speech right now and thinking about how many challenges the competition authorities and also the governments have. And then I remember another one, which is the current war tariffs or trade war, if we can say that. Do you think this is also can play an important role when we talk about competition law enforcement?
Okay, before I get to your question, let me just add one thing to what I said. I think that what I said, besides the fact there is a widening of the socio-political preoccupations of countries, and that competition law have to deal with those issues, I think that more precisely, there are two or three things that competition authorities have to do. One of them is to have a longer-term perspective. Because if you talk about sustainability, we're not talking about tomorrow. And one example I have in mind, which is when under the first Trump administration, there was the Department of Justice went after 4 firms, automobile manufacturer, for having agreed with the state of California to put on the Californian markets cars that would be more efficient than what was required by federal legislation. The rationale for that was typically classical rationale. You're going to put on you agree to put on the market cars which are going to be very sophisticated, which means that prices are going to go up because there's a lot of technology in those cars, which means that is going to be to the detriment of consumers because they're going to have to pay higher prices because the other cars won't be around. Now, if you look at it in a different time perspective, you can say, well, this is an agreement to decrease the cost of transportation in California. But for this, you have to think about the ultimate result. You have to have a different perspective. So that's one thing that has to change. Another thing is that economists, and there the blame is more with economists than competition authorities, but economists don't understand innovation. I mean, there are as many economists as there are theories about the relationship between competition and innovation. Not quite, but at least there's Schumpeter, there's Arrow, there's Aguillon and Scherer in the middle. And none of those theories are particularly helpful for competition authorities when they have to deal, let's say, with a merger and with the likelihood that is going to lead to an innovation or not. innovation has become the central element of growth, so we need this. So we need a better theory of competition and innovation, and probably a more dynamic one. And finally, we need competition authority to accept the fact that there are trade-offs between efficiency on the one hand and different other considerations. Now, back to your question about trade thing. I think the fact that we've moved into a period where I wouldn't say that it's protectionism, but there is a bit of this, and there's certainly a trade war with retaliations has three essential impacts on competition. The first one is pretty obvious. The fear of retaliation is something that is included in the reasoning of competition authorities and of governments. There's nothing new there. The Boeing-McDonnell-Douglas merger was already one, and even before that, there were trade wars being fought following or in anticipation of competition decision. What has changed is that the threat of retaliation has become more realistic, and the retaliation can be very expensive. Okay, so as Nelly Kroes, for example, or various other commissioners have said, this is not something you can completely ignore when you enforce. We see that probably in the choice of cases which is brought by some competition authorities. We see that certainly between China and the US, but also between the US and Europe and many other countries. So yes, there is an impact on enforcement. Competition authorities have been very keen to protect their independence, and to a certain extent they do it, but still, I mean, in the Google ad tech case, you may have noticed that the sanctions were announced after the trade commissioner said they could be announced. Okay, so clearly there are interferences, even if they are light. Or in China, there were a number of issues that were dropped because of trade negotiation with the US when it came to the digital sector. The second impact is because international trade has become less vigorous from that point of view, at least in terms of competition than it used to be. This means that there are more competition problems domestically in a number of domestic markets, and there's possibly more scope for competition authorities to intervene. Particularly in the area of oligopolies, there may be, and which is a difficult area for competition authority. But there's a third, and I think worst case of impact of this trade restrictive mood that we have developed, which is the risk of loss of independence of competition authorities. Now, if I take this year in succession, first, the Justice Department and the FTC have decided that it was the FTC that they were there to serve at the wish of the president, and the Justice Department that it was an America First antitrust, whatever that means, but clearly it was not independent of the executive. Then if we go to Mexico, we find that there was an issue not so much against the competition authority, but all independent regulators, and they were seen as being too independent, and they were brought back into the fold of the government. COFECE succeeded to a certain extent in protecting its independence, but still, I mean, there is. Then we moved to the UK, where the head of the CMA was summarily dismissed because the CMA was seen as not contributing to economic growth enough, because he wanted to be clear, he wanted only to look at efficiency. Then we can go to Europe. And to Europe, the reason why we don't have a Director General for competition is the fact that there's a battle within the Commission between DG Comp, which wants to keep on doing exactly what it has been doing in the past, and Mr. von der Leyen and the rest of the Commission, who want to bring back some form of industrial policy as at least a complement to competition policy, and therefore to have evolutions, particularly in the merger control area. Then I can go to individual countries. I don't know if you saw the interview of Martin Snoep from the Netherlands, but 2 weeks ago, saying that in Netherlands, and in Europe in general. Economies were cast aside, and lobbyists were replacing them because one went from the technical level to the political level directly. If I take Israel, which has many other problems, but the government of Israel has been trying to eliminate publicly the Director General of the IAA for not following the orders of the government. And I could continue like this. All this is essentially within 1 year. Now, what does it tell us? It tells us that competition authorities who insist on being A, independent, and B, pure, only focused on consumer welfare, are in fact facing two choices. They do not realize how they became independent in the first place. And they became independent because of the trade negotiations, nothing to do with the fact that pure theory is the absolute light. During the trade negotiations in the WTO and also at the bilateral level, each party wanted to make sure that if the other party committed to eliminate public barriers to trade, they wouldn't be replaced by private barriers to trade. So each one said, okay, I'm going to lower my trade barriers, you're going to do the same, but I want to have a recourse in case my exporters still cannot access your markets because there are some private anti-competitive practices. So it's the trade negotiators who insisted that as a complement to the trade negotiation, the trading countries should have a competition law, and B, should have an independent competition authority to make sure that the government could not bias the result. Okay. Well, we're now in a protectionist era. There's no more support for independent competition authorities, okay? Because the very reason why there was one was the international trade, okay? So competition authorities do not have the support now that they used to have at the end of the previous century until 2001, which was essentially the end of the trade liberalization negotiations. So they have two choices. Either they recognize the fact that the social political values of government have become more complex, that they now include sustainability, they now include resilience, strategic independence, innovation, and growth, and that efficiency is still useful, but it is not the end of the story. And they have to face the fact that there are possible trade-offs occasionally between those two. Now, those trade-offs, by the way, competition authority love to say, oh, I can't do trade-offs because it's too complex. But they do it all the time when you deal with intellectual property and competition. So it's not a question of principle. Or they stick to their guns, which is what DG Comp is trying to do now, which is what CMA tried to do. But if they stick to their gun and there's no support for their independence, they will lose their independence. And they will be absorbed into a more complex setup where there will be industrial policy as well as trade policy, as well as competition policy within the government. So I think that they really have to face a strategic decision. I'm very much in favor of the fact that they should remain independent, but to be acceptable, this independence has to go with a certain amount of understanding of the fact that the goals, the economic and political goals of government have changed slightly because of the reasons which I've mentioned.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor Giannella, we could spend the whole day listening to you. Thanks very much for sharing your thoughts. I think they are very inspiring for generations of lawyers, economists, and enforcers. And it's a great honor for IBRAC, and I say that on behalf of our president, René, to have you here. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the morning. And please join me in applause.
Thank you very much.